The translucent doors of Waypoint 7 space station hissed open, releasing a cloud of decontamination mist that momentarily obscured the silhouette of Ambassador Lyra. When the vapor cleared, she stood perfectly still, her iridescent blue skin reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting of the human space station. Her six-fingered hands clasped a datapad tightly to her chest, as if it might shield her from the chaos assaulting her senses. Waypoint 7 was nothing like the orderly Xylosian diplomatic vessels she was accustomed to. Humans of various appearances rushed past her, shouting greetings or instructions to one another. The air was thick with competing scents, processed food from vendor stalls, mechanical lubricants, and the distinct odor of multiple species coexisting in recycled air. Announcements in 12 different languages blared overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a child was crying. Lyra took a measured breath, activating the subtle respiratory filters in her nasal cavity. Maintain composure, she reminded herself, the mantra of her diplomatic training echoing in her mind. Order amid chaos. She consulted her datapad, which displayed a station map with a route highlighted in pulsing green. According to her itinerary, the Xylosian Welcome Committee would be waiting in Reception Hall B, ready to escort her to her quarters and brief her on tomorrow's negotiations regarding shared deep space mining rights. The logical course of action was to proceed directly there. However, as she attempted to follow the map, she noticed the directional markers on the walls didn't match her guidance system. Either her map was outdated, or the humans had rearranged their infuriatingly inconsistent signage again. After 15 minutes of increasingly frustrating navigation, Lyra found herself in a residential corridor far from her destination. To make matters worse, she could hear the distinct sounds of an approaching group, loud, enthusiastic human voices discussing the Xylosian ambassador and making a good impression. The last thing she needed was an impromptu welcome from overeager station staff when she was disoriented and unprepared. Acting on instinct rather than her usual careful deliberation, Lyra ducked through the nearest door, which slid open automatically at her approach. She would recalibrate her navigation system in private, then proceed to the official reception with appropriate dignity. The Xylosian High Council would not be pleased to hear their representative had gotten lost like some disoriented tourist. As the door closed behind her, Lyra realized she had made a serious miscalculation. This was not a public waiting area or meditation space as she had hoped. She stood in what was clearly someone's private quarters, and a particularly chaotic one at that. The room assaulted her senses even more than the station corridor had. Every surface was covered with objects, clothing draped over chairs, containers of what appeared to be food in various states of consumption, small models of spacecraft hanging from the ceiling on barely visible threads. The walls displayed colorful images of planets, vintage aircraft, and humans in various poses. Music with a pulsing, irregular beat played softly from hidden speakers. Before she could retreat, a voice called out from an adjoining room. "Be right there. Just tell cargo control I'll have the manifest signed in." A human male emerged through a doorway, toweling his damp hair. Reception committee was clearly searching for her. As if sensing her dilemma, Jake raised an eyebrow. "Avoiding someone? I am. Recalibrating my approach," Lyra said carefully. "The official reception can be somewhat overwhelming." Jake nodded knowingly. "Say no more. Committee meetings are my least favorite part of the job, too." He cleared a stack of what appeared to be physical books, an archaic human information storage method, from chair. "Have a seat. Hide out as long as you need." Lyra hesitated, mentally calculating the protocol violation metrics of her situation. Entering a human's private quarters uninvited. Violation level 3. Delaying arrival at an official reception. Violation level 2. Engaging in unauthorized conversation with non-designated personnel. Violation level 2. Yet somehow, the thought of leaving this strange, cluttered room to face the rigid formality of her duties felt more uncomfortable than staying. Perhaps a brief observational period would be educational, she said, carefully lowering herself onto the cleared chair. Xylosian diplomatic training encourages cultural immersion. That's the spirit, Jake said, clearing more space by sweeping items from one surface to another, essentially redistributing rather than reducing the clutter. Want a snack? I've got some blazing hot cheese crunchers. They're contraband from Earth, but worth the smuggling risk. He tossed a brightly colored package to her, which Lyra caught reflexively. She examined the packaging with scientific curiosity, noting the excessive use of exclamation points and the cartoon image of what appeared to be a cow wearing sunglasses while engulfed in flames. A biologically impossible scenario. The coloration suggests high levels of synthetic additives, she observed, carefully opening the package and extracting a single orange triangle. She analyzed it visually, then brought it closer to her sensory glands, just below where a human's nose would be. The aroma indicates capsaicin compounds and processed dairy enzymes. Jake watched her with amused fascination. You could just try it. That's the human approach to snack food. With careful precision, Lyra broke off a minuscule corner of the cheese triangle and placed it on her tongue. Her eyes widened involuntarily as her taste receptors registered the intensity of the flavor. This is, she paused, searching for the appropriate diplomatic terminology, aggressively flavorful. Jake burst into laughter. That's one way to put it. Too much. Lyra was surprised to find herself breaking off another small piece. It is unlike anything in Xylosian cuisine. Our nutritional supplements are calibrated for optimal efficiency without sensory distraction. She tasted the second piece, finding that her taste receptors were already adapting. This appears designed specifically for sensory stimulation rather than nutritional value. Welcome to human food, Jake said, grabbing a handful of the triangles and tossing them into his mouth. All sensation, minimal nutrition. He gestured around the room. Make yourself comfortable. Mi casa es su casa, as they used to say back on Earth. Lyra's translation implant struggled with the phrase, eventually rendering it as, my dwelling contains your dwelling, which seemed spatially impossible, but she understood the sentiment of hospitality. As the voices in the corridor faded, Lyra found herself relaxing incrementally. This human's quarters, while chaotic, offered a strange form of sanctuary. The longer she stayed, the more she rationalized that this was an unexpected research opportunity, a chance to observe authentic human behavior outside the sanitized environment of diplomatic functions. And if she was entirely honest with herself, a practice her training encouraged only in private reflection, there was something intriguing about this human with his casual manner and inexplicable name. The cluttered room of Jake Maverick, Riley became, for reasons Lyra couldn't quite logically articulate, someplace she didn't immediately wish to leave. So, Jake said, dropping into a chair opposite her, what brings a high-ranking Xylosian diplomat to Waypoint 7? Besides hiding in random pilot's quarters, I mean. Despite herself, Lyra felt the corners of her mouth twitch in what humans might recognize as the beginning of a smile. Jake noticed the almost imperceptible change in Lyra's expression with a keen eye that belied his casual demeanor. There was something fascinating about watching the composed alien diplomat wrestle with basic human informality. He'd transported beings from dozens of species across the known sectors, but Xylosians had always been particularly intriguing with their reputation for logical precision and emotional restraint. I am here to negotiate the terms for joint mining operations in the Cygnus sector, Lyra explained, her posture gradually relaxing by millimeters. The mineral deposits on asteroids within the neutral zone would benefit from our combined technological approaches. Sounds thrilling, Jake said with a hint of sarcasm that seemed lost on Lyra. He rummaged through a drawer and produced a dented metal container. Thirsty? I've got coffee, though everyone tells me mine is terrible. I am adequately hydrated, Lyra stated, but then paused, recalling her cultural immersion directive. However, in the interest of comprehensive research, I would be willing to sample this terrible coffee. Jake grinned and poured a murky brown liquid into a chipped mug emblazoned with the slogan, "Pilots do it in the stratosphere." He hesitated before handing it to her. Fair warning, this stuff could strip paint off a shuttle hull. Lyra accepted the mug with scientific curiosity, examining the liquid's viscosity before taking a careful sip. Her facial ridges, normally as soft lavender, darkened to deep purple as her taste receptors processed the bitter as salt. This is, she struggled to find a diplomatic characterization, fascinating. The bitterness coefficient exceeds our measurement scales. She took another sip, seemingly determined to understand the appeal. Yet I detect humans consume this voluntarily, even enthusiastically. It's an acquired taste, Jake admitted, drinking from his own mug without flinching. And mine is particularly bad. I never get the water-to-grounds ratio right. Perhaps I could calibrate it for you, Lyra offered, her scientific mind already calculating optimal extraction parameters. Jake laughed. Most people just tell me to stick to pre-packaged drinks. As they sat in surprisingly comfortable silence, Lyra's gaze wandered around the room, cataloging the chaotic collection of items. Her attention fixed on a shelf displaying small models of various spacecraft. "Are these representations of vessels you have piloted?" she asked. Jake stood and carefully took down one of the models, a sleek transport with irregular hull modifications. Some of them. This was my first ship, the Horizon Runner. She wasn't pretty, but she could thread through asteroid fields like nobody's business. His voice softened with obvious affection. "Saved my life more times than I could count." Lyra observed his expression with interest. "You attribute sentience to your vessel. All good pilots do," Jake said with a shrug. "You spend enough time alone in deep space with only your ship keeping you alive, you start to feel a connection." He handed the model to Lyra. "Go ahead, she doesn't bite." Lyra carefully accepted the model, examining the intricate details with genuine curiosity. Xylosians view technology as functional tools. We do not typically form emotional attachments to equipment. "Your loss," Jake said simply. "Some of my best relationships have been with starships." A notification chimed softly from Lyra's comm unit. She glanced at it, and her posture stiffened again. "The reception committee is organizing a search party," she noted, her voice returning to its formal cadence. "I have disrupted station protocol by my absence." "You could just tell them you're conducting important cultural research," Jake suggested, taking the model back and carefully returning it to its place. Technically not a lie. Lyra appeared to consider this, her head tilted slightly. "There is logical merit to your suggestion. This interaction has provided valuable insights into human living patterns and communication styles." She glanced around the cluttered room again. "Though your organizational system defies conventional categorization principles." "I have a system," Jake protested with a smile. "I know exactly where everything is." "Indeed? Where's your regulation station ID badge?" Jake's smile faltered as he glanced around. "Okay, bad example." He began rifling through piles of items, eventually discovering the badge under a stack of outdated flight manuals. "See? Right where I left it." "Fascinating," Lyra murmured, making a mental note about human post hoc rationalization behaviors. Another notification chimed from Lyra's comm, more insistent this time. With obvious reluctance, she rose from her chair. "I must report to my duties. The High Council expects detailed progress reports on schedule." Jake nodded, surprising himself with his own disappointment. "Duty calls. I get it." As Lyra moved toward the door, she hesitated. "This interaction has been educationally valuable." "Is that Xylosian for 'I had a good time'?" Jake asked with a knowing smile. "A simplification, but not inaccurate," Lyra admitted. After another moment's hesitation, she added, "Perhaps further cultural observation sessions would enhance my diplomatic effectiveness." Jake's eyebrows rose. "Ambassador Lyra, are you suggesting we hang out again?" "Hang out implies suspension in space," Lyra noted, though her translation matrix provided the colloquial meaning. "But yes, additional interaction could prove beneficial." "I'm off duty tomorrow after 1600 hours, Jake offered. "Feel free to stop by. I might even clean up a bit." "That would be," Lyra seemed to search for the right word, "acceptable." As the door slid open, Lyra straightened her formal attire and resumed her diplomatic posture. Just before stepping through, she turned back. The cheese triangles were indeed intriguing. I would not object to experiencing them again. With that, she was gone, leaving Jake staring at the closed door with a bemused expression. His quarters suddenly seemed quieter and oddly emptier than before. Well, Maverick, he said to himself, glancing around at his chaotic living space. That's not how I expected today to go. He picked up the package of blazing hot cheese crunchers, noting that Lyra had neatly resealed it after her sampling. With a thoughtful expression, he set it aside rather than returning it to his jumbled food storage area, just in case she really did come back. At precisely 1,600 hours the following day, Jake's door chimed. He had spent the morning on a routine supply run to the outer docking rings, and the afternoon making a half-hearted attempt to bring order to his quarters. The result was marginally less chaotic, though a truly organized person would have noticed little improvement. The door slid open to reveal Lyra, standing with perfect posture in what appeared to be slightly less formal attire than the previous day, though still remarkably structured compared to Jake's off-duty clothes. "You came back," Jake said, unable to keep the pleasant surprise from his voice. "I indicated that I would," Lyra replied, stepping inside as the door closed behind her. Xylosians maintain their scheduled commitments. Human pilots have a more flexible relationship with schedules, Jake admitted with a grin. "Come in. I've got something I think you might enjoy." He led her to a small table he had cleared, upon which sat several containers of food items. "I thought we could continue your education in human cuisine. This is what we call a snack sampler." Lyra examined the colorful array with scientific interest. "You have prepared a comparative gustatory experiment." "I've set out some munchies," Jay corrected with a laugh. "But yeah, basically." Over the next hour, Lyra methodically sampled freeze-dried ice cream, a textural paradox, instant ramen, efficient delivery of sodium compounds, breakfast cereal with artificially enhanced sweetness, nutritionally questionable but stimulating, and various other human comfort foods that Jake had collected from around the station. In return, Lyra produced a small container from a compartment in her attire. "This is standard Xylosian nutritional compound XN7. It contains all essential nutrients required for optimal functioning." Jake eyed the pale blue powder suspiciously. "Does it taste like anything?" "Taste is irrelevant to nutrition," Lyra stated, though she added after a moment's consideration, "but no, it was specifically designed to be organoleptically neutral." Jake took a tiny amount on his fingertip and tasted it. His face contorted into an expression of disappointed disgust. "It tastes like nothing. Absolutely nothing. That's actually more disturbing than if it tasted bad." "Efficiency eliminates the need for sensory distraction," Lyra explained, though Jake noticed she reached for another cheese cracker immediately afterward. As they continued their culinary exchange, Jake found himself increasingly fascinated by the subtle changes in Lyra's behavior. Her posture, while still perfect by human standards, had lost some of its rigid quality. Occasionally, her formal speech patterns slipped into slightly more casual phrasing. Most noticeably, she had begun to display barely perceptible facial expressions, a slight widening of her violet eyes when surprised, a nearly imperceptible curve of her lips when amused. "So what was on your diplomatic agenda today?" Jake asked, leaning back in his chair and balancing it on two legs, a habit that caused Lyra to watch with concerned fascination. "Preliminary discussions regarding extraction methodologies and profit-sharing algorithms," she replied, delicately wiping her fingers on a napkin after trying a particularly dusty cheese snack. "The human delegation has interesting perspectives on risk allocation." "Sounds riveting," Jake said, not entirely hiding his sarcasm. "It was not," Lyra admitted, surprising him with her candor. The Orion representative spoke for 43 minutes about the historical significance of mining rights without contributing any substantive proposals. Jake laughed. "And here I thought being stuck in a maintenance queue for 3 hours was bad." "What does your work entail when not queuing for maintenance?" Lyra asked, seeming genuinely curious. Jake's face lit up. "Want to see something cool?" Without waiting for an answer, he moved to a wall panel and touched a series of controls. The room's lighting dimmed, and a holographic display activated in the center of the room, showing a three-dimensional map of local space. This is my route from last month, he explained, tracing a complex path through asteroid fields and around gravity wells. Supposed to be impossible to navigate with a cargo vessel this size, but I found a shortcut through this nebula. To his delight, Lyra stood and approached the display, her eyes reflecting the blue light of the holographic stars. This trajectory defies standard navigational parameters, she observed, studying the path with keen interest. That's why they call me Maverick, Jake said with pride. I specialize in the impossible runs. When irregular carriers say it can't be done, they call me. This approach to the Cygnus boundary shows remarkable spatial reasoning, Lyra noted, her finger hovering over a particularly complex maneuver. The conventional route would require an additional 73 hours of travel time. Jake stared at her. You can calculate that just by looking at the map? Of course, Lyra said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Spatial mathematics is a basic skill taught to Xylosian children. For the next hour, they discussed deep space navigation, with Jake sharing stories of his most daring runs and Lyra offering insights into Xylosian theoretical approaches to fifth-dimensional space folding. Jake found himself increasingly impressed by her quick grasp of practical applications, while Lyra seemed genuinely intrigued by his intuitive approach to problems her people would solve with complex equations. Their discussion was interrupted by an insistent chime from Lyra's comm device. She checked it with a barely perceptible frown. The Xylosian delegation is requesting my presence for an unscheduled briefing, she said, her voice returning to its more formal tone. Duty calls, Jake said, trying to hide his disappointment. Same time tomorrow. Lyra hesitated only briefly. That would be acceptable. As she moved toward the door, she added, this session has been most informative for my understanding of human navigational intuition. Is that diplomat speak for I had fun? Jake asked with a grin. Lyra's lips curved slightly. A reasonable interpretation. After she left, Jake found himself staring at the holographic star map, still displaying the route they had discussed. There is something about explaining his adventures to someone who actually understood the technical complexities that felt deeply satisfying in a way casual storytelling in station bars never had. He was already looking forward to tomorrow. The following days established a pattern. Lyra would complete her diplomatic duties, then appear at Jake's quarters during his off-duty hours. Each visit lasted longer than the previous one, their conversations growing increasingly comfortable and wide-ranging. Jake introduced Lyra to the concept of music as entertainment rather than functional background sound. Her initial assessment of his preferred rock music as rhythmically irregular and unnecessarily loud gradually shifted to a fascination with the emotional responses different songs evoked. He caught her one evening unconsciously moving her head in rhythm to a particularly driving bass line. For her part, Lyra brought aspects of Xylosian culture that surprised Jake with their depth and beauty. She shared recordings of mathematical harmonies that created not just sound but subtle vibrations that resonated through different parts of the body, creating what she described as physiological harmony. Their most significant connection came unexpectedly when Jake mentioned an old science fiction Hollywood series called Cosmic Frontiers that he'd been obsessed with as a teenager. The special effects are horrible by today's standards, but the stories about different species learning to work together despite their differences really got to me as a kid, he explained, slightly embarrassed by his enthusiasm. It's probably why I ended up working in space instead of on Earth. To his astonishment, Lyra's eyes widened with genuine excitement. You are familiar with Cosmic Frontiers? This series was included in our cultural studies curriculum as an example of human speculative fiction. I found the narrative structure unexpectedly compelling, despite its scientific inaccuracies. Jake stared at her in disbelief. You're a fan of Cosmic Frontiers? The cheesy old show with Captain Xander and the improbably diverse alien crew. The interpersonal dynamics between Captain Xander and Science Officer Clara were particularly well developed, Lyra said, her typically formal tone giving way to something that in a human might be called enthusiasm. The episode dealing with the temporal paradox in the Bellerophon sector was especially thought-provoking. Echoes of Tomorrow, Jake exclaimed. That's my favorite episode too. What followed was an animated discussion of plot points, character development, and philosophical themes that had them both talking over each other in their excitement. Behavior Jake had never observed in Lyra before. I still have the complete series, Jake admitted. Want to watch an episode? Hours later, they had viewed 3 episodes, with Jake providing behind-the-scenes trivia and Lyra offering surprisingly insightful analysis of the show's underlying themes of unity amid diversity. They sat side by side on Jake's small couch, their shoulders occasionally touching as they gestured to emphasize points during their commentary. It was during the 3rd episode that Jake's antiquated media player began to malfunction, the holographic projection flickering and distorting. Damn it, Jake muttered, tapping at the controls. This thing is always glitching at the best parts. Perhaps I could assist, Lyra offered. Xylosian technical education includes basic maintenance procedures for most common technologies. What followed was an impromptu repair session, with Jake's haphazard toolkit spread across the floor as they both knelt beside the disassembled player. Jake's approach involved percussive maintenance techniques. Sometimes you just need to hit it in the right spot, while Lyra methodically traced circuit pathways with a microprobe. Their collaboration resulted in a series of increasingly amusing failures. A projection where all the characters appeared upside down, audio that played at double speed, while the visuals ran in slow motion. And at one point, a bizarre mashup where Captain Xander's dialogue came out of Science Officer Tlarius' mouth, and vice versa. The sight of the stoic Vulcan-like Science Officer dramatically declaring, "Let's blast these space pirates back to the cosmic Stone Age," and the captain's gruff voice sent them both into fits of laughter. Jake's loud and unreserved, Lyra's more contained but nonetheless genuine. It was the first time Jake had heard Lyra truly laugh. The sound was melodic and slightly higher pitched than her speaking voice, with a quality that made him think of wind chimes. They finally got the player working properly, though by then it was well in a station night cycle. As the episode concluded, Jake realized with a start that Lyra had been absent from her delegation for nearly 6 hours. "Won't your people be wondering where you are?" he asked. The question seemed to snap Lyra back to reality. She checked her comm unit and her posture stiffened. "I have 17 unacknowledged messages," she said, her voice returning to its more formal cadence. "This is unprecedented in my diplomatic service record." "Sorry," Jake said, feeling genuinely contrite. "I didn't mean to get you in trouble." "The fault is mine," Lyra said, rising quickly to her feet. "I failed to maintain appropriate attention to my duties." She paused, looking around the room with an expression Jake couldn't quite read. "I have never experienced such a lapse in temporal awareness." As she gathered herself to leave, Jake noticed her lingering gaze on the frozen image of the Cosmic Frontier starship on the screen. "We still have 2 seasons to go," he said softly. "The show gets even better." Lyra met his eyes, and for a moment, her diplomatic mask fell away completely. "I would very much like to continue our viewing experience," she said, her voice carrying an emotional quality he hadn't heard before. "However, I must address my responsibilities." After she left, Jake sat alone in his quarters, staring at the paused image on the screen. Something had changed tonight, not just in Lyra's behavior, but in the way he felt about her presence in his life. What had begun as an amusing diversion, a break from the monotony of station routine, had evolved into something he looked forward to with increasing anticipation. He was startled from his thoughts by an incoming message notification. Opening it, he was surprised to find a communication not from Lyra, but from station security. "Pilot Riley, be advised that unauthorized extended visitation by diplomatic personnel requires appropriate clearance and documentation. Please report to Security Office 12B at 0900 hours tomorrow to discuss compliance procedures." The official tone couldn't quite hide the implied warning. Someone had noticed Lyra's frequent visits to his quarters, and station administration was taking an interest. Jake sighed and closed the message. Complications were arising, as they always seemed to when something good entered his life. But for once, he found himself unwilling to simply change course and fly away from the problem. Whatever was developing between him and the Xylosian ambassador felt worth navigating through the bureaucratic asteroid field ahead. The next day, Lyra did not appear at Jake's quarters after her diplomatic duties, nor did she come the following day. Jake attended his meeting with station security, where he received a stern lecture about protocols regarding diplomatic personnel and unauthorized fraternization, followed by a mountain of forms requiring his acknowledgement of station regulations. On the third day of Lyra's absence, Jake was performing maintenance on his ship when his comm unit chimed with an incoming message. His heart leapt, but it was only his dispatcher assigning him a last-minute cargo run to an outpost in a nearby system. As he prepared for departure, an official station notification arrived. All personnel, be advised that negotiations between the Human Alliance and Xylosian Confederation have concluded successfully. The Xylosian diplomatic delegation will depart from Docking Bay 7 at 0800 hours tomorrow. Standard traffic restrictions will apply during diplomatic vessel departure. Jake stared at the message for a long moment, a hollow feeling expanding in his chest. Lyra was leaving, had perhaps already retreated from their unexpected connection back into her rigidly ordered Xylosian life. The thought bothered him more than he cared to admit. He was halfway through his pre-flight checklist when his door chimed. When it slid open, Lyra stood there, her posture as perfect as ever, but something different in her eyes. "I calculated you would be preparing for departure," she said without preamble. "Your dispatcher's communication frequency is not difficult to monitor. You're tracking my work assignments?" Jake asked, surprised. "I have been efficient with my information gathering," Lyra replied, stepping inside as the door closed behind her. "May I enter?" "You already have," Jake pointed out with a small smile. "I thought you'd gone back to being the perfect diplomat." "I have maintained all expected diplomatic protocols," Lyra said, her voice carefully neutral. "However, I find myself experiencing cognitive dissonance regarding our imminent departure." Jake set down his checklist. "In human terms, you mean you're sad about leaving?" Lyra's gaze met his. That would be an emotional simplification, but not inaccurate. She moved further into the room, her steps measured. "I have received a formal reprimand regarding my excessive cultural immersion activities and potential compromise of objectivity. The High Council is concerned that I have become too influenced by human perspectives." "Have you?" Jake asked quietly. "I find it increasingly difficult to maintain optimal Xylosian detachment," Lyra admitted. "Our interactions have introduced variables into my cognitive processes that were not previously present." "Is that a bad thing?" Jake asked. Lyra was silent for a long moment. "By Xylosian standards, yes. Emotional considerations are meant to be secondary to logical assessment. Yet I find myself prioritizing certain experiences that have no logical justification." Jake took a step closer to her. "Like watching old sci-fi shows with a scruffy pilot? Like enjoying the company of an individual who approaches life from a paradigm that contradicts my training," Lyra corrected, though there was a softness in her voice that hadn't been there during their first meeting. "It is unsettling, and yet I cannot categorize it as negative." Jake ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture he rarely displayed. "Look, Lyra, I don't know exactly what's happening here, but I know I'm not ready for it to end. We could, I don't know, stay in touch. I make cargo runs near Xylosian space sometimes. The High Council has reassigned me to the Central Diplomatic Corps on our homeworld," Lyra said. "I will not be returning to this sector. They believe distance from human influence will restore my optimal functioning." "Will it?" Jake asked. Lyra's violet eyes searched his face. "I am uncertain. I find myself experiencing a previously unknown form of internal conflict. My duty to my people and position is clear. Yet I also recognize that our interactions have expanded my understanding in ways that may ultimately benefit my work. And on a personal level," she hesitated. "Yes," Jake prompted gently. "I find that the prospect of returning to my previous existence without the variables you have introduced creates a sensation of incompleteness." Jake smiled sadly. "I think the human word for that is loneliness." "Perhaps," Lyra acknowledged. a concept Xylosians rarely discuss, but perhaps experience nonetheless. They stood in silence for a moment, the reality of their situation hanging between them. Two beings from vastly different worlds, whose paths had crossed by chance and created an unexpected connection that now faced the immutable realities of their separate lives. "I must return to my delegation's preparations," Lyra finally said. "Our vessel departs at 0800 hours. "I know," Jake said. "I got the notification." Lyra moved toward the door, then stopped. "The logical course would be to thank you for the cultural education and proceed with my duties," she said, her back still to him. "However, I find I'm not entirely satisfied with logical courses at this moment." She turned to face him. "Would it be acceptable within human cultural parameters if I were to embrace you before departing?" Jake felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. "More than acceptable," he managed to say. "It's kind of tradition, actually." Lyra stepped forward somewhat hesitantly, clearly uncertain of the proper procedure. Jake gently pulled her into an embrace, feeling her initial stiffness gradually relax as she adapted to the contact. "Fascinating," she murmured near his ear. "The physiological response to this form of contact is remarkably complex." "That's one way of putting it," Jake said with a soft laugh, reluctantly releasing her after a moment that felt both too long and not nearly long enough. Lyra stepped back, her composure slightly disrupted in a way Jake found endearing. "I must acknowledge that this form of physical communication conveys information that verbal exchange cannot fully replicate. That's what makes it special," Jake said softly. "Indeed." She straightened her attire in a gesture Jake had come to recognize as her way of regaining emotional equilibrium. "I should depart now." "Lyra," Jake said as she reached the door. "For what it's worth, I think the High Council is wrong. The connections you've made here, the way you've bridged our different worlds, that makes you a better diplomat, not a compromised one." She paused, her hand hovering over the door control. "Your assessment contradicts official Xylosian diplomatic doctrine, but contains elements I find increasingly persuasive." Her voice softened. "Goodbye, Jake Riley. See you around the galaxy, Ambassador," he replied, attempting to maintain his usual casual tone despite the heaviness in his chest. After the door closed behind her, Jake stood motionless in the center of his quarters. The room seemed unnaturally quiet, the absence of Lyra's precise, measured speech creating a silence that his usual background music couldn't fill when he finally switched it on. He had experienced goodbyes before. The nomadic life of a transport pilot was full of temporary connections and casual partings. This felt different in ways he wasn't entirely prepared to examine. With mechanical efficiency, he completed his pre-flight checklist and departed for his scheduled cargo run, throwing himself into the familiar routines of his work. The next morning, his transport was 50,000 kilometers from Waypoint 7 when the Xylosian diplomatic vessel departed. He watched it on his scanner as it engaged its elegant, energy-efficient drive system and accelerated smoothly into higher dimensional space, as precise and orderly in its departure as its occupants. Then it was gone, taking with it the most interesting person Jake had ever encountered. The emptiness of his cabin had never felt quite so noticeable before. Objects that had always been scattered in comfortable disarray now just looked messy. The models of ships he'd flown, once sources of pride and nostalgia, seemed like childish toys. Even his prized collection of contraband Earth snacks had lost some of their appeal. His first day back at Waypoint 7 after his cargo run, Jake found himself wandering past the now-vacant conference rooms where the negotiations had taken place. A maintenance worker was removing the last of the Xylosian signage, erasing the physical evidence of their presence from the station. "Shame they left so quick," the worker commented, noticing Jake's attention. "Weird folks, but at least they were clean. Not like those Rigelian trade delegations. Take weeks to get the smell out after they leave." Jake nodded absently and continued on his way. In his quarters, he stared at the inactive media player where he and Lyra had watched Cosmic Frontiers together. On impulse, he activated it, queuing up the episode they had struggled to repair together. As Captain Xander and his crew faced an impossible spatial anomaly, Jake found himself wondering what Lyra would say about the scientific inaccuracies, imagining her precise observations and the subtle way her eyes would widen when particularly engaged with a plot point. His comm unit chimed, interrupting his thoughts. His dispatcher had another cargo run ready, a long-haul transport to the edges of Alliance space. Just the kind of challenging, solitary assignment he would normally relish. "I'll take it," he confirmed, welcoming the prospect of losing himself in the complexity of navigating dangerous sectors. 3 weeks later, Jake returned to Waypoint 7, his cargo successfully delivered despite an unexpected ion storm and a brief standoff with overzealous Border Patrol vessels. The run had been exactly the kind of adventure that had built his reputation as a pilot who could deliver when others couldn't. He had expected to feel the usual satisfaction of a difficult job well done. Instead, he felt oddly disconnected from his accomplishment, as if something fundamental had shifted in his perspective. As he entered his quarters, the door sliding open to reveal the same comfortable chaos he'd left behind, Jake realized what was different. For the first time in his career, he had found himself wishing there was someone specific to tell about his adventures, someone who would understand both the technical challenges and the emotional journey. Someone with violet eyes and a formal manner that occasionally gave way to genuine wonder. With a resigned sigh, Jake tossed his flight jacket onto a chair and began unpacking his gear. As he emptied his duffel bag, a small object tumbled onto his bed, a package of blazing hot cheese crunchers, the same brand he had shared with Lyra during their first meeting. He stared at it for a moment, then chuckled softly to himself. "Sentimental idiot," he muttered, though there was no real self-reproach in his tone. His personal terminal chimed with accumulated messages. Most were routine, payment confirmations, maintenance schedules, social invitations from other pilots. The last one, however, caught his attention. It had been routed through multiple relays, its origin point obscured by layers of encryption that would be unusual for regular station communication. Opening it, Jake found himself looking at a message with no video component, only a text communication in a standard format that could have been generated by any number of species. Observation: human nutritional supplement designated blazon hot cheese crunchers produces paradoxical sensory responses that merit further investigation. Insufficient data for comprehensive analysis. Additional sampling recommended. Jake read the message 3 times, a smile slowly spreading across his face. It was simultaneously the most formal and the most rebellious communication he could imagine from Lyra, a perfectly logical request for more information that was, between the lines, a deliberate reaching out across the boundaries that separated them. He sat at his terminal, fingers hovering over the response interface. What could he possibly say that would bridge the vast differences between their worlds? How could he acknowledge what had passed between them without pushing against the constraints she undoubtedly still lived within? Finally, he typed, "Field research suggests optimal assessment requires multiple sampling sessions in diverse environments. This researcher willing to transport specimens to appropriate testing locations as needed. Data collection protocols flexible." He added his transport's secure communication frequency, then sent the message along the same encrypted path that hers had traveled. There was no way to know if she would or could respond. The Xylosian High Council might well be monitoring her communications now that they suspected her compromise. Yet as he leaned back in his chair, Jake felt lighter than he had in weeks. The universe was vast, filled with seemingly insurmountable distances and differences. But he had spent his career finding unexpected paths through supposedly impassable terrain. One way or another, he suspected he and Lyra hadn't completed their final data exchange just yet. 3 days later, as Jake was reviewing a particularly complex flight path for an upcoming mission, his secure channel activated. There was no visual, just an audio transmission rendered in the familiar, precisely modulated tones he had come to associate with the most interesting person he'd ever met. This researcher has identified potentially valuable comparative data on human musical appreciation patterns that could benefit from in-person collection methodology. Scientific integrity suggests continuation of the initial research project with expanded parameters. Coordinates and temporal window to follow on sub-channel frequency. The transmission ended as abruptly as it had begun, followed immediately by a burst of encrypted data containing coordinates near the border of Xylosian space. Jake found himself grinning like an idiot at his navigation console. He quickly checked the coordinates against his star charts, calculating potential routes and fuel requirements. It would be a challenging journey, requiring creative navigation around several restricted zones, exactly the kind of impossible run he specialized in. His dispatcher would question the detour. Station security might raise concerns about unauthorized contact with Xylosian officials. There would be forms to fill out, regulations to navigate, explanations to fabricate. But as Jake plotted the course to the rendezvous coordinates, he found himself humming a tune from Cosmic Frontiers, the theme that played whenever Captain Xander and his crew faced what seemed like insurmountable odds with ingenuity and determination. Some connections, it seemed, were worth breaking a few rules for. And while Jake couldn't predict exactly where this particular flight path would lead, he knew with absolute certainty that he wouldn't be making the journey alone. In her austere quarters on Xylos Prime, Ambassador Lyra sat perfectly upright at her workstation, the picture of Xylosian composure. To any observer, she appeared to be engaged in routine diplomatic documentation, her movements efficient and her expression appropriately neutral. No one would notice the slight change in her breathing pattern when the confirmation arrived from a certain Maverick pilot. No one would recognize the significance of the small container of garishly orange triangular snacks hidden beneath precisely folded clothing in her storage unit. And certainly, no one would interpret her detailed requisition for expanded cultural research materials as anything other than exemplary dedication to her diplomatic duties. But as Lyra allowed herself the smallest of smiles, a facial expression she had once considered unnecessary and inefficient, she knew that something fundamental had changed. The ordered, predictable path she had always followed had intersected with a chaotic, unpredictable flight pattern, creating something neither of them could have navigated alone. The space station corridors might separate them now, but somewhere between the stars, their paths would cross again. And when they did, Ambassador Lyra, logical, composed, and increasingly comfortable with the concept of emotional navigation, would be ready for the next unexpected adventure.